Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Lardner of the Marxist Education Project. Today is that last day before May Day, and when booking Rob McKenzie to come here and speak, I thought, what an appropriate weekend for this talk. It is the workers' weekend of the year, and despite the American capital forcing Labor Day on us as they did, but I'm very excited to have a presentation with discussion with Rob McKenzie, who became aware of this work within his work at the UAW. And that's all the story that Rob's going to tell. Tomorrow we have at 4 p.m., you may have seen this if you are here on my weekend email, we have an update on the women's movement and cooperative movement within that resistance in Rojava, and that will be at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Then on the Tuesday event on the London Revolution has been postponed until June, but next weekend we have on Saturday, John Bellamy Foster meeting with Marcello Musto. One is speaking on the Marx revival around ecology, and Marcello, that's John Bellamy Foster, and Marcello will be speaking on the section from that Marx revival book on communism. Then on the 8th, in a related book and in the same, Rob, is your book in the Pluto Wildcat series?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, a great series. We've hosted a number of these books. Another book in that series is Arise by Jane Holgate, and she did not come to her previously scheduled event because she was on strike, and the server at her campus was altered in such a way that all the emails she and I had going back and forth with one another were going into spam during the period, and she missed the Zoom link and everything. But she is coming a week from tomorrow to speak on her book, Arise, and looking at signs of potential strength in labor's renewed insurgency. You're hearing too much from me right now. I'm turning the Zoom room floor over to Rob McKenzie. Thank you, Rob.
So I'll start at the beginning, and if you want to move me forward, don't hesitate to interrupt. But I was working at a Ford assembly plant in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1990 when our local heard about an attack that had taken place on workers in a Mexico City Ford plant. A bunch of thugs, we call them golpeadores as the Spanish term, came in and got in a fight with the workers and opened fire, and 9 were shot and 1 died. So we began to do support work for them along with some other locals in the United States and some other unions in other countries in Brazil and Europe. And within a year or two, this movement had been crushed. But in 1996, I was at a meeting for the Coalition for Justice of the Maquiladoras in Brownsville and Matamoros. And at the conclusion of that meeting, an aide for the newly elected president of the AFL-CIO, Sweeney.
What's the matter?
Excuse me? Sweeney came up to me and told me, well, they believed AFL had been involved in those events. And I had asked him why. I mean, were they linked to the CIA, I guess was my main question. And he said, yeah, we thought they were. I still do not know why he made that conversation with me, what they were trying to get. I couldn't get any more information at the time. But as the years went by, I heard from a couple other good sources that AFL had been involved with these events at the Mexican City Ford plant. So when I retired in 2016, I started researching this. So I'm just going to briefly go over what I found through interviews with some of the workers in Mexico, with embassy cables, which I got from the Freedom of Information Act. In the 1980s, Mexico was really in economic turmoil as a result of the early depression, the worldwide depression of the early 80s, the collapse of oil prices. They were suffering hyperinflation, unemployment. They stopped a lot of social spending and spending on infrastructure. And in 1985, a big earthquake hit Mexico City, which really added to the misery. And in response to the botched government attempt to deal with the earthquake, people started forming self-help groups. Now, in 1988, there was an election that took place where one of the members of the ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, split off and ran a campaign against the PRA, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, and he was associated with some leftist groups who'd also emerged from the earthquake situation. They did win. It's widely agreed now that that was a fraudulent election, massive fraud, and Cardenas won it. The military seized the ballot boxes and they were burned a couple years later, and there's never even a recount. In that situation, in the Ford plant, opposition really arose to the wage cuts and changes Ford was making. In response to this big inflation spike, Ford went into negotiations with the government union, the Confederation of Mexican Workers, or the CTM, in 1987. One of the things I found out is in those negotiations, the CTM agreed that Ford would not match the government's approved wage increase of 27%. They would call a strike, but then Ford would pay half the wages of the workers while they're in strike. Because the economy was so bad, they really needed to do a layoff. And this is the plan they came up with, except there was a major problem. Under Mexican labor law, after 3 months on strike, an employer can terminate a labor agreement. And after 4 months, Ford terminated the labor agreement. They eventually ratified a new agreement, but that included a second-tier wage scale, which meant everybody who was rehired took a 40% wage cut. And 600 people were not rehired after they fired everybody when they terminated the contract. Everyone was brought back except 600 with a 40% wage cut. So there was a lot of opposition to all this in the late 80s, and that was focused around a group called the Revolutionary Workers' Party, or the PRT. And by the late 80s, their supporters had control of that local union in Cuautitlan, Mexico, the Mexico City Ford plant. And they were doing a lot of very good things. They began having regular union meetings, listening to what workers were saying, filing grievances, very unusual things in the world of unions in Mexico. And they gained a reputation, and they were getting ready to run against the general secretary who controlled all the Ford plants in Mexico. And they were sure they were going to win, just where the size of their plant was so much bigger than the others, and where the votes fell, they thought they were going to win. Ford fired 4 of the 6 local executive committee members right before that election in 1989. And of course, the incumbent who'd been appointed won election. But that really increased the struggle at the Mexico City Ford plant. They formed something called the Ford Workers Democratic Movement and really launched a big struggle to get the fired people back, but also to continue the struggle they had started before. They did hunger strikes, protest marches in the city. The hunger strike took place in front of the Ford headquarters in Mexico City. And in that December of 1989, there was a major pay shortage as a result of some manipulations Ford had been involved with the CTM in the spring. Those came home to roost, and many workers got no paychecks. Others got very small paychecks, and the workers walked out and went on strike and held press conferences and elected a commission to negotiate with the company because they did not trust the CTM. So that was right before Christmas. Everybody went home for Christmas holiday, and the workers agreed they would come back to work on January 3rd, a Monday. That January 5th, the leaders from the local came down to the plant to hand out a leaflet to tell workers to come to a meeting on January 8th with the head of the CTM union to talk about their many problems and grievances. The workers were kidnapped at gunpoint, and they had done a lot of things to these guys. They had fired them. They had threatened to kill them. They had beaten them. They had done just about everything they could but kill them. So they thought they were going to be killed by these guys. They probably would have been. But the workers in the plant heard about this and began a sit-down strike demanding the release of their leaders. This is on Friday, January 5th. And that worked. The leaders were all released that day. So everyone was coming back to work again Monday the 8th. And the leaders started hearing on Sunday night strange things were going on in the plant. Strange people were there. Some of them were wearing Ford Union uniforms, and they expected they would be in there in the morning. So the leaders made plans about what to do. So that morning, Ford had planned to fire the leaders of the January 5th work stoppage and had called the police in to take them out of the plant. So while that was happening, 300 golpeadores, or thugs involved in a coup, I mean, they can be translated as hitters, batterers, were in the plant, all wearing a Ford uniform. They all had IDs, Ford IDs, around their necks. The workers were ready, and they started intimidating the workforce in the 5 different buildings on this plant complex. And the workers picked up tools and fought back and started driving them out of the plant. At that point, they pulled out firearms and started shooting. And 9 workers were shot, one of whom later died from his wounds. But then they fled the plant, realizing the police were going to come. So that is what happened there. In response, the workers occupied this Mexico City Ford plant for 2 weeks. They took it over and occupied it. And they issued a number of demands. One of those was for a National Democratic Congress to be held on labor rights in Mexico, which was really what the problem was. And we're still struggling with that in Mexico. There are a lot of gains have been made in the last few months. But they eventually were driven out by about 2,000 police 2 weeks later. The strike went on for another few months before Ford was ever able to get the situation under control. And they ended up firing another 600 people. So those are the basic outline of the events. What my research has shown that those golpeadores, those 300 people, were paid for by, were under the command of a CIA contract agent, a gangster named Wallace de la Mancha. So now we want to go into that. I can talk about that for a while, but that's really what I came to. AFELD was deeply involved in all these events. That's the American Institute of Free Labor Development. They had their office in the CTM office building in Mexico City. They had a guy assigned to work on this issue who I don't know much about. I do know about his father was likely a CIA agent. And I think the most telling document I found was right after this Mexican election had been approved in late October of '88, I have a flight document of a private jet flight from Washington, D.C. to San Diego. On this flight are Tom Donahue, the AFL-CIO Secretary-Treasurer, Owen Bieber, the president of the UAW, 2 of their staff people, one for the AFL and one for the UAW, Mark Anderson and Steve Beckman, and a 5th American named William Doherty. I'll get to him in a second. And also 3 Mexican union leaders, including the head of the Ford CTM, who they ran against a few months later. So the William Doherty, when I started this project, I said, well, I wasn't sure what the American Institute for Free Labor Development was. I thought I would be able to prove their involvement in this, but what did that mean? And originally, I thought there had been an authoritative source on AFELD, what it was, linking it to the CIA. There wasn't. So I spent several years researching AFELD, and I tracked who they were, what they were in the first 4 chapters of the book. And the guy who's there the whole time, who was executive director for 30 years, was a guy named William C. Doherty, Jr. And that's the guy that was on the plane. And there is no question in my mind, he was a career CIA agent. So I compiled quite a bit of evidence about that. And he's a character throughout the entire book in Mexico, and even touches my local at one point in 1990s. So there's a kind of a rough outline, Michael. I don't know if you want me to continue on with this or.
Well, that's it'd be really very good to see what type of organization still exists in Mexico that is dealing with this type of intervention. What kind of contacts there have been with locals such as yours with the Mexican workers, and hopes for international working class solidarity in the face of such united opposition with not just the state and capital, but our so-called working class organizations. I know that you've done some of that, but it would be
Sure. No, I can certainly go there. So I would say, and sometimes I get feedback from young people, well, this is kind of depressing because they really were able to crush this movement. And that is true. That is what happened. These left labor groups in Mexico in the 80s were opposed to NAFTA because they thought it gave too much control of the Mexican economy to foreign corporations. That opposition was pretty much wiped out in the late 80s, and Mexico sailed through with Salinas. And then one of the things I found out was right after this election, the CIA had been telling the Reagan administration, do not worry about Mexico. It's a stable country. Nothing's going to go wrong there. Well, then after the 88 election, and it almost went to a left of center populist government, they had egg in their face, and they moved very quickly, the U.S. intelligence community. They sent a new ambassador there, a guy named John D. Negroponte. So maybe some of you know who he is. He became the first director of national intelligence. He had been in Honduras previous to this, working to support the Contras in violation of a law Congress had passed saying we were not going to fund the Contras. He was arranging with the Honduran government to support the Contras and then getting huge amounts of U.S. aid for Honduras, of course, in close collaboration with the Reagan administration. So the deputy chief of mission who went with Negroponte was a guy named Robert Pastorino, who had been on the National Security Council as a chief advisor for Latin America to Reagan. He'd also been in Honduras with Negroponte. He went to Mexico. He wrote the first conceptual draft of NAFTA, Robert Pastorino. And Negroponte, in later interviews, said his greatest accomplishment while he was in Mexico was facilitating negotiations between Bush and Salinas for NAFTA. And they also brought with him a third guy, a guy who'd been the CIA station chief in Honduras, who had trained a counterinsurgency battalion in Honduras that later became a death squad. And so he got a lot of bad press years later. His name was Vincent Shields. He also went to Mexico City. So in November to December of 88, right after this election, all three of these guys are there. So what did that mean? So they were pretty successful in beating down the left in Mexico and getting NAFTA passed, and we're still living with the impact of that. But today, in the last few months, there have been some tremendous developments in independent unionization in Mexico. And that is one of the first guys who was researching a Mexican labor activist in Mexico for me sent me an email one time saying he'd just been at a conference where a new auto workers labor federation had been formed in Mexico. And that, of course, was Cynthia, who has now won an election at GM Silao, a huge GM assembly plant in Mexico, by like a margin of 85%. Then they went on and won a big one in Matamoros a few months ago, a big parts dealer. And a couple of weeks ago, they won another big victory at a Panasonic radio plant. And these are all like margins of 85%. So the current president of Mexico, López Obrador, is supporting independent unionization. And this union federation has really been able to take advantage of it. So something I've started working on in the last few months is trying to raise funds for them. And there's a petition, an online petition. Of course, GM is not being a good negotiations partner. The last thing they want is them to have success at Silao. But, we're moving forward, and that is, it's taken 30 years really to recover where they were at in the late 1980s in independent unionization. But they have really come a long way in that regards.
So, Rob, you would like to open the floor for questions and comments?
Yeah, I could talk all day, but again, I might as well try to talk about things people are interested in hearing if I can.
Well, if anyone has a question, either raise your hand with in the screen or with the icon in the bottom of your Zoom screen, or write the word stack. And Carol, you're there already. Go ahead, Carol.
I have a trigger finger. That's a lot to take in. I lived through the Reagan 80s, and I remember the Iran-Contra. I also read the book. What's the guy, the Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
I did read some of that. Yeah, I did read some of that. I don't remember his name. But
I can't remember. He's very self-congratulatory, but I read a couple of his books, and the amount of interference and there's some really good parts of that book. So that's about my familiarity with the CIA. But what would you attribute the change in tenor toward the labor movement in Mexico? Has the CIA backed off? Has the Mexican democratic system working better, or what?
Those are good questions. Yeah. So both those things have happened. So instead of AFELD, we have the Solidarity Center now. They are actually aiding Sentia. What I think has happened is the Biden administration has recognized that having this huge pool of very cheap labor in the border has been very politically destabilizing for the U.S. And it has, not only the loss of jobs, but immigration. So they would like to see stronger unions in Mexico. They're actually helping Sentia. Now, the other thing you mentioned is, of course, there's a big election in Mexico, and the AMLO, or Lopez Obrador, a populist of a lot of different positions, but definitely not aligned with the previous party, has been very helpful to labor. He has signed a minimum wage increase, and in regards with the new trade agreement, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, has had elections held, and all these plants, people get to vote on contracts they've never voted on before, or for unions that have representing that they've never had a chance to vote for. So that's why these last 3 elections were held, is because Lopez Obrador signed a law and changed Mexican labor law. So I would say the position of the U.S. and its international agencies has changed, and the government of Mexico has changed. And those are things that were vital. I mean, these guys came very close to winning this struggle at Cuautitlan and getting elected into an important position in the CTM. But they had the Mexican government against them. Of course, Ford was against them. They had the Mexican government against them, and the CIA, who really was, I think, the deciding force enough to push the scale down and defeat them. And those things aren't there now. And, I'm not tend to wild optimism, but I think things are going really well. I'm working with a group called the Mexico Solidarity Project. So you can look that up online if you want. And they're advocating on behalf of the Morena Party, which AMLO is part of, but their main focus now is helping Sentia. So I've got a link on my website that connects to Act Blue for contributions. They're really trying to raise some money to help these guys. So what their goal is to try to buy them a van right now. But Mexico Solidarity Project, I think, is a fine group, and I am working with them now.
George, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question?
No. Sorry. Yes. No. Thank you. No.
Oh, okay.
Can I ask a follow-up then? What is your website, and has NAFTA been supplanted, and was it Trump that ended NAFTA? And what's your website?
Yeah, is robmckenzie.org. So I changed it so it'd be easy to find because I was having trouble. But the link is on the my works page in my website. And if you click on the one El Golpe, the book, which is the next link, there's a link there for the Mexico Solidarity Project, one to sign the petition at Silao to GM, and one to make the contribution through Act Blue Charities to Sentia. And did I answer all the questions you asked?
NAFTA. Has NAFTA been
Oh yeah,
supplanted?
yeah. Of course, Trump, smart as he was, he had no idea what he was doing, but he came out against NAFTA. And I'm telling you, I know so many industrial workers and people in these communities are so bitter about NAFTA, even to this day. Even their kids have inherited some of that. And if you look what got Trump elected by less than 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, all former heavy industrial states, he knew what he was doing campaigning against NAFTA, because unfortunately the Democrats would never do it. Not as a national level. Individuals, of course, did. But I attribute that to how he's got elected. So he came in saying he wanted to change it, but he had no idea what he wanted to do. I mean, he was talking about $15 an hour jobs. I mean, they're making little two is what were making. And that was never going to work. But the Democrats and Pelosi got involved and added the part about people having the right to vote on contracts and vote on their unions, which has really made the big change. There's $15 an hour jobs, but they're 10 years down the road. And he's just kicked the can down the road for someone else to deal with. So we have the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement now. So he want to get rid of the name NAFTA and say, I got rid of NAFTA. So it's got another name now.
Peter Fay.
Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to throw in something with the Panasonic election, which happened election happened last week, I think.
I think it was too.
Yeah. My daughter worked for Solidarity Center, previously known as Bayfield, and when I was younger, that was basically the CIA. We all knew it as the CIA, but now it's been renamed to protect the guilty. And of course, it definitely has a different role now. They actually are promoting, in some areas, real unionization through the Solidarity Center. But this USMCA, from her perspective, this is really game changing. The ability that the U.S. has to revoke trade agreements for violators of labor law in Mexico has been huge, and some of them have gone right ahead violating labor laws and have been shocked to find out that it actually affected them. And Panasonic was one of those that was violating the labor laws over and over and over again. And the question is, some of these, it only really applies to those that actually trade with the U.S. So if you're manufacturing in Mexico and sell your manufacturing product to another manufacturer in Mexico, which then comes to the U.S., then it's, of course, you can continue to violate the USMCA. But anyway, I agree that the USMCA had a huge impact. I wouldn't attribute the great provisions to Nancy Pelosi in any way, but rather I would say Trump and these other folks that really went up, put the pressure on the Democrats to cave in. They were opposing Trump's plan. The Democrats were opposing USMCA, whereas the Republican president was pushing it. Just amazing set of circumstances that, but anyway, I appreciate what you said. It's a really fascinating subject.
Yeah, a lot of these, I've done quite a few of these Zooms and radio shows, and it's not always popular to say the Solidarity Center is doing some good things, but they are. I think they follow the lead of the State Department, and they are doing some very good things in Mexico right now. And exactly what came out of those negotiations for the USMCA, I don't know. So I said Pelosi because, of course, she took credit for it. And I'm sure the AFL-CIO and the other unions were very strong on pushing for change, and they have been for decades, and they're finally able to get some change. So it is a little bit different world now.
Rosie, you wrote in Stack. Is that something you would like to ask about? Rosie?
Hi. That's the name of the gentleman who wrote Confessions of a Hitman.
Oh,
What
John
was it?
Yeah,
John Perkins is the name
Yeah.
of the author of Confessions of a Hitman.
right.
Okay, thank you, Rosie.
You're welcome.
So,
in talking about some of the research, trying to find out really what AFELD was. There was Phil Agee's book, Inside the Company CIA Diary, which I had always heard of but never read. 700 pages, clearly identifies AFELD as a CIA front and William Doherty as a career CIA agent. And so I researched Agee, and he totally reliable source. Two CIA papers accredit him with being fair and accurate in what he'd written in the book. So that was a starting place. And in the last few years, there's been some very good stuff come out in AFELD. In 2018, a labor historian in Manchester, England, wrote quite a bit about AFELD in his book. His name is Anthony Carew, and the book was American Labor's Cold War Abroad. And then there were two papers, one by a guy named Thomas C. Fields, who wrote about the origins of AFELD, and another one by a guy named Jeff Shirky, who wrote. They used slightly different original sources, but when you put all that together, the story of what AFELD was, which is a government-created agency managed by the CIA, for which the AFL-CIO gave cover to, is clear now. Now, the AFL-CIO has never said one word about this, and that's one of the problems I'm having, is they will not make a clear break with their past or even discuss it. One of the reasons I'm doing a lot of things like this is to make enough noise that they have to address this past. Because I really believe this, and this is involved in labor directly for 38 years in organized labor. Unless unions can truly connect with international workers' solidarity and make it a core value, they're not going to go forward. And they cannot do that without acknowledging this past, which was really collaboration with the CIA to our own harm, especially if you look at what happened in this Mexico plant. Grievous injury done to U.S. labor by labor's own actions there. So this is something that the AFL-CIO needs to acknowledge and move forward from.
So, Rob, when you say AFL-CIO, the UAW is in the AFL-CIO umbrella, and you work within. You're a local.
I'm retired now. I was a local president for 8 years, and then after that, I was in the national staff for 10 years of the UAW. And I was on the executive board of the Minnesota State AFL-CIO for 12 years.
So during your time during your research, when we talk about the AFL-CIO in collaboration with the CIA, did that also mean a section of the UAW bureaucratic structure was engaged in assisting the CIA and Ford Motor against Mexican workers?
When I started this, I have to tell you, I was quite naive about where things were at. I thought that this had been dealt with and that the AFL-CIO would be interested in what I found out about Cuautitlan and AFELD. I knew two people very well in the national staff of the AFL-CIO, and they started out helping me till the hammer came down, and this was a taboo subject which no one has been allowed to talk to me about. So then I moved on to the UAW because I had just retired. I had been hired by the then president of the UAW, Dennis Williams. I said, and I knew that system very well. I said, well, I'll be able to find their files because I was told they had files on Cuautitlan, and I ran into the same roadblock there. Nobody would talk to me, including Dennis Williams. I bet I knew the appeal procedure and all the procedures, and finally maneuvered them into a point where I did find out where their files were at Wayne State University at the Ruther Library, but the file labeled AFELD, or American Institute for Free Labor Development, the contents had disappeared. So actually the last 3 chapters of the book are my efforts to find out what happened at Cuautitlan. So it includes all my interactions with the AFL-CIO and the UAW and the State Department and the various institutions who had information about this are invested in keeping that quiet and covering that up now. So this certainly includes the UAW. I mean, part of when I was writing this, there was a corruption scandal that went on in the UAW. I don't know if you guys were aware of that. 11 top officers, 2 presidents, 3 vice presidents, all are in prison for corruption. So I have to say that did affect my view of what's going on here. I know unions do not like dissent. They do not like people challenging unpopular things they did that maybe seemed to be unpopular. But my experience was there was not enough of that in the UAW. More people who were aware of the things going on should have spoken out. So I was determined to follow this wherever it led and not stay quiet about it. So yeah, the UAW and still is not doing much to support Sentia. As many jobs as we've lost, they're doing very little, next to nothing to help Sentia right now. I was told the Solidarity Center asked the UAW to help and got a negative answer on that. Why? I couldn't really explain. I don't know.
So at this point, now that union activism is stepping up in Mexico, do you see Ford, GM, Chrysler? There must be other, I'm sure Toyota is doing assembly in Mexico at this point.
They're not, but Nissan is.
Nissan.
Yeah, and Volkswagen, yeah.
Do you see the UAW supporting Mexican workers now, or does the UAW at our U.S. national level see this as some type of threat, or is there more an integration to keep the radicalism of the Mexican workers down?
I'm baffled by the UAW, what they're doing with this, which is nothing. I cannot really get a good explanation of why they're doing so little. I mean, I was just trying to investigate this a little more last week. I know they don't want to do anything that's going to put me in a good light, but I mean, to give no money to Sentia, which is where they're at, they haven't made any donations to Sentia. I have no good explanation. What I fear is, and I don't know this for a fact, is that the MAGA view is so prevalent. We don't want to help the Mexicans. These Mexican workers are taking our jobs. It's prevalent enough that they just don't see this as a popular issue. I don't know. If anybody's from the UAW is listening, maybe they could explain why they're not helping, because I don't get it.
Peter, I'm sorry, I missed that you had a second stack. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to mention that, this new information coming out about AFILD. You're old enough to know what the current, what people were saying about the AFILD way back in the 80s, 90s, whatever.
Yeah.
So none of this is new. So, I mean, how do you, what is your opinion of what people thought of AFILD way back when you were just starting out? I mean, when I talked about it, people I knew all knew that it was subsidized. It was openly discussed that it was a CIA front. So how do you interpret this change in attitude about exposing AFILD?
Those are excellent questions. I think when my research in the mid 70s, so you had Phil Agee's book come out. You had Victor Reuther write a book where he said AFILD was CIA. And then you had a guy named Fred Hirsch, a rank and file activist in San Francisco, who interacted, I believe, with a bunch of Chilean exiles. And he wrote a great pamphlet about it too. So between those three things, I think everybody on the activist left knew that AFILD was CIA. But as my publisher told me, and this was, I think the first time I submitted a manuscript was like 2018 or 2019, he says, they always tell us AFILD CIA, but nobody's ever documented anything. And I couldn't find anything that documented that. Now, these papers are by younger people. Well, first of all, Tony Carew or Anthony Carew. First of all, U.S. labor historians have done diddly squat with this issue of Afeld. Nothing. And they still won't step up to the pump on it. I understand some of the reasons that if they do, they'll be locked out of the archives. They won't be labor historians anymore. But I think there's really been a problem with U.S. labor historians stepping up and writing about the whole issue of the CIA. Now, the exception to this is this Anthony Carew, who is at the University of Manchester in England. And he's studied the CIA and Cold War, labor in the Cold War, his whole career. And he was very helpful to me. He gave me contacts. He engaged with me in a discussion. I mean, I couldn't figure out why nobody had ever talked about Irving Brown, who was the International Affairs Director from 82 to 86. He'd been identified by like 8 different sources, 5 of them former agents, that he was CIA. And in 1982, Lane Kirkland appointed him the International Affairs Director of the AFL-CIO. And I was able to get an interview for a guy who worked under him, and oh yeah, he didn't question that at all, that he was CIA. So this has been known, but not really written about. So Tony Carew wrote a book, and the other 2 papers were written by young people. I mean, Jeff's got to be early 30s, maybe that old, and I'd say Thomas C. Fields about the same time. And Fields got into the Meany archives and recorded a lot about the history of Afeld. And Jeff got into the University of Chicago and got into their correspondence. That was the first academic institution that worked on the idea of Afeld. So they don't really take it from beginning in. They add pieces and pictures. But when you lay it all out together now, it is definitely there, what happened and what Afeld is. But that is still one of the things I think about. Why has the AFL-CIO never come out and said, well, yeah, we had this past, it was a mistake, or we had this past, it wasn't a mistake, the Cold War was tough, we had to do these things. I mean, you know, the chapters in my book researching Afeld, 3 of them, one was British Guiana, one was Brazil, one was Chile. These were democratically elected left of center governments that Afeld helped get rid of, that they really destabilized the government was their main role here. Also, there was probably worse things happening under the cover of Afeld. And that's hard for AFL-CIO to come up and say, yeah, we did these things. They won't do it. They just refuse to talk about it. They won't say we didn't do it, but it is a very ugly past, and it's really hard to move forward without confronting that. I mean, no institution likes to admit they did something wrong, whether it's the Catholic Church and the pedophile scandal, or it's the General Motors and their terrible ignition switch. Everyone would rather not deal with these things because, you know, our mission is so important. It will hurt us if we tackle these things. But unions are something different. I mean, we have to have the ethical and moral high ground to be successful, and we don't have it. That's my view there.
David? You have to unmute, David.
Yeah, okay. Well, I when you say that, you know, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking, well, why do you think this is something that's in the past? I mean, I can readily imagine that in any number of certain kinds of institutions in this country, that the CIA has taken an active interest in having an influence in, that there in the executive highest levels of those institutions, that there are staffers there, you know, that make it their point to make sure, for example, that files disappear, or that that the institutions don't, that nobody in those institutions gets out of line too much. And part of the way that's done is not by sometimes I think there's a certain element of fear in terms of that people's careers will be ruined, as a number of journalists in this country, you know, who have gone out on a limb to expose CIA wrongdoing have had their careers utterly destroyed. And I think also there's a big element of bribery, literally bribery, because I know for a fact in Latin America, one of the ways CIA works, or U.S. intelligence works, is they'll find somebody that's an activist, in a political party or a labor union or something that they think would be vulnerable to this. They'll just literally say, come work for us. We'll give you like $2 million or something, and they get people that will do it. Thinking of Lenin Moreno in Ecuador, it's one of them.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. I've had some really strange things happen to me on this 5.5-year project. I'm retired. I can't be fired. There's really not much they can do with me. And when I started, I thought I'm just going to leave out the Solidarity Center. I'm not exactly sure. Sometimes they do stuff good, and I'm just going to leave this alone. But then as I started researching this, I came out the origins of the Solidarity Center, where I had a guy who was a former AFL director in Mexico and an assistant director of the AFL-CIO. When I contacted him, wrote me 2 very long emails. I was shocked by that. But one of them said that the Solidarity Center was not a Sweeney project. It had begun as a Kirkland Donahue project before Sweeney came. And I also found an interview with William Doherty in 1996, where he said, well, now the Cold War is over and we have this new economic system, call it neoliberalism, he said. We've got to figure out how to promote trade unions internationally. And what he said, we need to work on trade issues and human rights issues, which is what I think the Solidarity Center was set up to do. Now, the first guy that was appointed the head of the Solidarity Center was a guy named Harry Cambrus. I go into quite a bit to his past in the book. His stepfather was identified by AG as a CIA agent. He was the Asian American Free Labor Institute director in South Korea, and an international businessman, where I found one quote, and I talked to the journalist who wrote that. He said, yeah, people at the State Department thought he was probably CIA. That was the first director of the Solidarity Center, Harry Cambrus. And he was removed, I think, in 2005, at the same time the AFL-CIO got rid of the International Affairs Department and laid off 167 people out of their total staff of 450. I know enough about union finances. There is no possible way 167 people were paid for out of union dues. Today, the International Affairs Department is 2 people, Kathy Feingold and a secretary. So that had to be government money. I couldn't get anyone to talk to me about that. There are people who know, including people in academia, well-known people who I tried to get to talk about it, would not do that. So, I'm certain I can't explain everything going on with the AFL-CIO. I know what happened at this Mexico plant in 1990, and I know what AFELD was. So that's mostly what the book's about. I see we have some other questions there.
Yes, there's one from Carol. And go ahead, Carol.
So I just was looking at Wikipedia on the American Institute for Free Labor Development. It's a very short stub, and they're looking for more citations for verification. So I don't know if that's worth anyone's time to do that. But
I've got about 20,000 words on them, so in the book.
Yeah. Oh, on the organization.
Yeah.
Well, you could link your book so that at the bottom there's further reading, and there's a couple.
I probably just do something like that. Okay, all right.
Anyone can become. It's
can
pretty simple to become an editor, but you do have to cite your sources, and somebody could come in and challenge it. But I have edited things on Wikipedia, so you could do it if you wanted to.
All right. Well, I had my manuscript legally vetted and was able to find an insurance policy because I'm expecting trouble. I just think that's the way this is going to work. But I haven't had anything so far. Nobody said anything. So
Peter,
I don't know if I want to wait into Wikipedia until I make sure I get my manuscript through.
Peter, go
You
ahead.
could even just link your book.
All right.
I consider Wikipedia a branch of the CIA anyway, because we know that they are editing, NSA and others are editing Wikipedia and managing a lot of the pages. But the, what's I going to say? Pretty much all you got to do is follow the money. So Solidarity Center, just like AFIL before it, is funded almost entirely by USAID, which of course is another, part of the intelligence community front, I guess you would say. They back channel information to the intelligence community, and also by the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. So these are, you can't get much more upfront public publicity that you are a CIA front than by getting USAID money. And it's been this way since the 1960s. So yeah, I know it was entirely funded. It wasn't funded at all. A Solidarity Center was never funded by the unions. It's always government money. And I suspect, well, I don't suspect. I think I know from some things I've heard that, that they're very closely tied to, in all these countries where they operate, closely tied to the State Department. They interact with the State Department all the time, and they report back to them. So it's very useful surveillance. But it doesn't mean they can't also do good work. I hope they did. My daughter did some of that. And they organize, for example, in Bangladesh, help organize female workers in the garment industry. And I'm not sure how effective they are, but it's another tool in the State Department. Basically, the State Department has multiple policies and ways to implement policies abroad, and one of those is Solidarity Center, and others are, of course, trade agreements and funding for other types of programs in the countries to try and grease the wheels for American investment, etc. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You don't want to, you can't pigeonhole any particular program as 100% one way or the other. And it doesn't surprise me that some of corporate America wants to see the Mexican labor movement more stable than it is. Just like in a lot of CIO organizing, some of the largest companies would sign without even as soon as you got a card check, they would sign a contract because that puts them ahead of their smaller competitors. And it's a way of organizing labor, organizing the production process, and rationalizing production. So it's not every corporation is inimicably opposed to unions.
My last report about the GM negotiations with Centia were that they had asked for, I think, $7 an hour, and GM was offering $2 and told them, don't look at American wages. You just have to look at other Mexican wages. So I would say GM is not on board with the strong independent unions yet, but I still think the Biden administration, you see the catastrophe at the border and the catastrophe they suffered in the working class. I think he would like to see some change, but I'm not holding any hopes for General Motors.
Rob, you've been involved with as UAW leadership. When I was a kid, the UAW and the CAW, the Canadian Auto Workers Union, often had conventions together. There was a lot of international solidarity in a sense. Is there any sign? I know that you said it's politically not possible for the UAW, but do you see any sign from locals or regional workers in the UAW to broaden an alliance with the Mexican auto workers, since so much of the manufacturing, assembly, etc., is now being done in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, that's so obvious, and I wish I could give you some better news about that. You know, the UAW, as part of the government consent decree, ended up agreeing to a membership vote versus the convention delegate system, which very similar to the PRI. They had the same oligarchy, had stayed in power for 60 years or something. Now they have to run in a membership vote. So the UAW is right in the throes of that right now. That people are running for delegate to go to a convention to nominate people, and then after that there'll be a membership vote. So I don't think anybody is thinking past that right now. I mean, it seemed to me like this international solidarity with Mexico would be a reflex. I mean, you know, $10,000 or $20,000 would be huge, and it really isn't a big deal for the UAW, but they're not doing it. And to the best of my ability, I've explored that. And that's a different UAW than I left that wouldn't do anything here. So it could be just everybody's focused on the election. I'd say overall, you know, there's some unions who've done fantastic things in international solidarity. And one of them would be the UE. That's kind of a small union, but they have really focused on that. And I think they're really going to benefit in the future. The steelworkers have done some good stuff with Mexico.
Could you give an example, Rob?
There was a leader of a Mexican miners union, and I can't remember his name right now, Gomez. So he complained about a mine accident where 100 people were killed and started raising hell about that and had to flee the country for his life. And the steelworkers employed him and took care of him for 10 years. He went back to Mexico, I think with the AMLO election, and got elected to Congress. And so he still has close ties with them in the miners union. And also the people I know who talked to the Solidarity Center said the steelworkers were helping in Mexico. Those are the only unions I know who are really doing anything. So if you know anybody in a union who would like to do something, we really need to put them in touch with the Mexican Solidarity Project and work on how they can help Cintilla.
So I don't need to write stack since I'm here. Some of the people here have been at other talks. There's someone at work who pulled in one day with this new vehicle, and he said, "Check this out," and he showed me the manufacturing sticker inside the driver's side door.
Yeah.
And this vehicle had been manufactured in 3 countries, including Mexico and the US and Italy, but it was finally assembled in Turkey and then sent back to, I don't know, Newark to be distributed from the large ocean-going shipping that brought the vehicle back. To me, besides just international solidarity within industries, but workers in general, this kind of phenomenon seems to be on more of an upswing than a tendency that's going away. Are you aware of broader, besides just US Mexican auto workers, international auto workers getting together more? Capital is obviously not going to care one way or the other if we have those rights to organize internationally. They are organized to do whatever is needed for their interests. And say if we did have solidarity with Mexico, it seems that capital is quite equipped to say, all right, we'll forget all that Mexican assembly and manufacturing, and we'll move it to Turkey. And if the Turkish workers are upset, we'll move it to Nairobi or someplace like this. Are you aware of broader international organizing being done in this way, or not much?
You know, there's been attempts. I know the UAW when Bob King was president, so what that would have been 2010 to 2014, really made some efforts in that area. In fact, the UAW had an organizer working in Mexico for 3 years. I'm not going to say his name here because I don't want to get him in trouble. He was working for another union, but he helped me quite a bit with this too. So there have been attempts. They just really, but when King left, the next president that came in completely eliminated all that work. So it hasn't been a consistent overall adaptation of unions to the core value, because that will move from one administration to another. Now, I know the AFL-CIO and the Trump administration, there were changes in the international labor organizations. There had always been a split between the pro-Soviet ones, the World Federation of Trade Union, and the Western one, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. They finally got over that and formed one single organization, I think during Trump's time. So in that regard, we don't have this Cold War division that we used to have. And, I can't say that I know what's going on at that high level internationally. But again, what I think is not just what one tactic or one struggle. It really needs to become a core value that it's not really debated whether we should have international worker solidarity. And I don't think the labor movement is at that point yet. I think part of the process of going through this, recognizing what had happened in the past and all the detrimental effects will help get us there. I don't see how we get to that without going through the past and recognizing what had happened. And nobody wants to do that I've seen. And I've looked.
Nobody that you know of in trade union leadership in the U.S.
Yeah, again, in the last 3 chapters of the book, I talk about taking this to labor bodies because I thought, they won't stand the embarrassment of finding this out, but they're willing to stand the embarrassment. They mobilized staff and officers and defeated it in one labor body. They really made a major effort to vote. And what my motion was to open the old AFELD files to researchers and members, because those haven't even been organized. I did finally get in there, but they're just files piled in boxes, roughly by subject, but they're not even organized by file, folder, or subject. No researcher can really use them in that state. They need to be organized. They're at the University of Maryland, the George Meany Memorial Archives. They want to do it, but the AFL-CIO won't give them permission. They're afraid of what's in there. And I mean, these are the things. It's just hard to move forward with true commitment to the international solidarity when you won't even open your own International Affairs Department files. Those are closed only by special permission, and I don't know if they give that to anybody for those International Affairs Department files. That's hard to move forward with this pass unless we recognize it, acknowledge it, account for it, and then we can move forward.
Get some good hackers who can break in and.
Well, these are paper files, my friend. These are paper files. So there are 4,400 boxes of AFELD files at the George Meany Memorial Archive, and they're under pretty tight security.
So that's an interesting question. Why are they so opposed to allowing this out? And I don't know what you think, but I mean, I know enough to know some of the history of how this attack on labor was used not only internationally but local, within the U.S. against the founders of the labor movement, against the CIO, against UE, as you mentioned. They were the largest union in the country until the labor, what they call the labor fakers, colluded with the McCarthy's group and the committees in Congress to rout out communists and socialists out of the labor movement. So this is their route to power, is not only repressing the militants in countries like Mexico or Dominican Republic, where I have some relatives that are still there, but also right here in good old USA, where they booted out, hundreds and hundreds of militants from all the industrial unions on a political witch hunt. So this is really part of that history, and I guess to me it's not surprising that they don't want that discussed. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree. Michael, would it be possible to take a 2-minute break? I put the dogs in the garage. I just want to check that they're okay. My wife's out of town this week.
All dogs are
I'll be back in 2 minutes.
dogs don't hide boxes in agencies. Go ahead.
Yeah.
We let the dogs out.
Yeah.
Are you with us, Kate?
I am.
Great. I just hadn't heard your voice yet today. So hello.
Well, I'm just fascinated. This is a union I'm not familiar with, so I'm really just absorbing none of it surprises me, but it pains me the lack of a sense of a bigger movement not materializing. And I don't mean necessarily from American unions, or from US unions, but that the sense of the need for an international effort is not as prominent as it could be. I'm wondering if young people who apparently are opening up more to the concept of unionizing are possibly going to help us move forward, given that they are more conscious of the internationalizing that has gone on in the world. More conscious, I say, than our peers. Because that internationalizing has happened during their lifetimes in very powerful ways. So I'm hoping that we may see some sort of activity, especially on an international level, coming from a more youthful movement.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And again, I'm not a huge optimist, but this Amazon labor union and the Starbucks workers, that is something new. And, the Amazon union, they really created their own labor organization. And I think that's an excellent point you make. I mean, this generation, borders didn't mean the same thing to them that they did to my generation. It's just a completely different concept. And I'm optimistic that they're much more open to what needs to be done. I mean, Amazon is a huge multinational corporation. It's hard to even talk about that as just one country company. So let's hope for the best.
And it seems to me they can step across racial issues and gender issues in a much more facile way than our peers. So that if the left can provide them with the kind of history that you've written about, eye-opening history that you've written about, and with if they welcome some guidance in terms of experience and particularly in organizing and in opening minds, then I think that we may have something going on here that could be positive.
Carol, you're on stack. And welcome to Steve Evans, one of the first people I ever met at the New York Marxist School back in 1978. Hey, Steve, great to see you. All right, Carol, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Just one quick comment and a question. I think I'm really excited to see Starbucks and Amazon unionizing, and I think the work conditions are so oppressive. That's a big benefit to people getting together. I can't imagine working in one of those warehouses. And the contingent precarious labor is. So what my question is, this is just, could you talk about why the unions couldn't move forward without processing this past, their involvement in these labor busting past. Is it kind of like reparations for slavery in the U.S. that until you grapple with what is done, you're going to be repeating the same mistakes over and over again? Or how would you explain that?
Again, when you're involved in a cover-up of what happened here, and they have been for over 50 years, I would just point to, in 1966, Victor Reuther went public in the Los Angeles Times saying that the AFL-CIO, AFELD, and the CIA were linked, and that they were involved in Latin America. Huge outcry all over, big uproar in the AFL-CIO Executive Committee meeting. So they had a meeting a few months later where they had promised Victor's brother, Walter, to discuss this whole issue of international affairs. And what they did was have a guy named Joe Bierne, who was president of the communications workers, and a guy, Phil Agee, identified 10 years later as being a top CIA collaborator in labor, make a motion to condemn Victor for this, which passed by a vote of 23-2, with Walter and the head of the Maritime Union voting against. So I thought that would be really interesting, because I know the UAW had a transcript done of these kinds of meetings, word for word. I think they've got one. It is in the International Affairs Department. And the George Meany Memorial Archives told me, well, after 50 years, we open everything. Totally untrue. Now, this is 56 years, that is still closed. So it's hard to know. So just looking at that, Joe Bierne, he is still lionized in the Communication Workers Union. There's a scholarship program named after him. What does that mean for them to confront this past? I mean, you have Sarah Nelson from the flight attendants, part of that union, is more on the progressive side, talking about challenging. What does that mean for her? What does she say about this past? I think that's one example. And it's, I think, true for so many unions. They're so enmeshed with this cover-up now, very hard to do a break. And, it's hard for anyone to admit you were wrong or you did things wrong and then you covered it up. Very difficult to do. Nobody does it unless they have to. And there just isn't the force in the labor movement internally to make that happen. That's what I think is some of the problems involved in this. They'll say,
until they do it.
I'm sorry. Until they do it,
they're going to keep suppressing more progressive outlooks. They're not going to grow. They're not going to embrace a broader perspective.
Yeah, it's hard to get out there and beat the drum with true conviction on international worker solidarity when we had this past, and people in Latin America and Africa and Asia know we had this past, and you don't come clean about it, apologize for it, or account for it in any way. It's really hard to beat the drum, mobilize your union, criticize your government, criticize the corporations when everybody knows we were all in this together. And nobody does it very well. I mean, it's, the state, they do it, it's fairly half-hearted. They don't want to get it in too deep because someone's going to start asking them questions about, well, what about this and what about that? I mean, what about the role AFL-CIO played in clearing the brush for NAFTA passing? I mean, those are brutal questions, but they're essential for us to really take the ethical high ground on these issues.
Thanks, Rob. David is there, and then Kate after David. Go ahead, David.
Actually, this is not my question I was going to ask, but since it came up, is it possible in your mind that some of these inaccessible documents are, in fact, living under some kind of national security classification, and that's why, they will not be released because they are, they've been stamped top secret, and I know they're not in the connection of the government. Even if they're not in the possession of the government, I wonder if it's possible that the government is still able to actively prevent their people looking at them. But the real question I was going to ask you is what you could say.
I got to write that
you could
down
say
because that's a
something
good
more.
question. Let me write that
Okay.
down first. Okay.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a good question. All right.
The other thing what I really wanted to ask was what you might be able to say about the state of the labor movement the union movement in Mexico today. I assume that in some ways it's suffered this similar. Well, the problem with I know the old national Mexican labor movement was totally integrated with the PRI, the political party.
Yeah.
That fell apart. The political party kind of fell apart, maybe 20 years ago.
Oh, no.
Or it became.
Well, they lost their monopoly in 2000. Yeah.
They lost their monopoly of power.
20 years ago.
Yeah, their total monopoly of power. They're still there, I know. But I was wondering, I'm assuming that the labor movement suffered some of the same vicissitudes that the union movement in the United States suffered, meaning that more and more companies and businesses no longer bothered to, wouldn't recognize unions, or unions didn't have people that weren't members of unions, or people weren't even interested in becoming members of unions, especially in Mexico, because they saw that the unions were just part of this political apparatus. So I'm just wondering if you could say anything about the current status of the union movement in Mexico.
I don't know. We'll have to look.
First, the question about maybe the AFL-CIO can't release the files because they're government. Actually, my research, again, I said AFL was a government creation managed by the CIA, cover given by the AFL-CIO. And I wondered, well, why did they end up with the files? Because they do have control of them. They're at the George Meany Memorial Archives. Well, probably because the only way the government could have kept them was to give up the cover and admit it always been a lie. And we're taking them because this was really a government agency. No one wanted to do it. Now, there may be some national security issues in those files. I would not be surprised if there was. Now, what I saw, because I got to look through 44 boxes of Mexico files managed by the CIA, they were very careful about what they put in files. They always had that in mind. Now, there was one box of people writing critical things about him, which were almost all true, but they were public documents. The International Affairs Department files, which is separate from the Solidarity Center and separate from AFELD, they have control over those. Whatever's in those are controlled by the AFL-CIO. I honestly think there's more information in there because there you had lots of IAMA staff people recording what was going on, saving documents, writing reports. They weren't under the control of the CIA most of the time. Some of the time they probably were. But anyway, those files, of course, the AFL-CIO could give up. Now, I think you're talking about is union density decreased in Mexico in the last period. It has everywhere else in the world. I don't know for a fact that it has in Mexico, but I assume that it has because it has in Europe and Australia and everywhere else. It's seen a declining level of union density among workers.
Kate is on stack. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, I thought one thing I wanted to ask is sometimes you can get access even to this very dark part of papers and documents through FOIA submitted by an individual who may be implicated or who may be involved or who may be. So it isn't you just as a researcher, but a person who has been involved in this stuff. I don't know if you've tried that approach to gaining access. So
yeah, I have actually.
You
That's
have
what really broke the manuscript open is I got 11 cables from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City to the State Department. Now that was a huge struggle too. I do not believe I would have got those had it not been for the intervention of U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin and her staff. I think that's why I was able to get those. But those were really revealing.
You submitted that from you as a researcher?
Yes.
Yeah.
I found an online, because I didn't know how to do it, an online source called Muckrock, which
Yeah.
mostly works on state level. But they said, don't bother with the CIA. They're not going to give you anything. Try the State Department. And I did. And it took a year before they got to mine. And then they inadvertently told me it was on a review process of some kind. And so what I find out then that they'd found documents, but they couldn't decide whether they were going to release them. After about 3 months of that, then I got Senator Baldwin's people involved, and they gave me 5 cables. And when I had those, I knew there had to be more. And I ended up getting 11 U.S. Embassy cables, totally revealing. I mean, I still think that Negroponte was using a CIA back channel to talk about this. That's what the Washington Post said he was doing in Honduras, so he didn't get caught working for the Contras.
Yeah.
Because there's some information from these cables, vital information, totally missing. And I think he sent it through the CIA. Now, I have not had any luck with my FOIA with the CIA. They're horrible. I mean, there must be so many exemptions to them that I thought I could get them at least to take a national security exemption. But since the book came out, like 6-8 weeks after the book came out, they sent me a letter saying, we don't have anything.
Yeah.
This is after 4 years of appeals and protests and submitting evidence. And so I'm not sure they're worth wasting the time with.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I actually started a new one with the FBI this week, but that's a whole nother story. But it's in the book, that part too.
Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to explore is, you know, or it's really just a comment, is that I got nervous when all of the Amazon and the Starbucks and these groups were all setting up their own little unions, very specific unions. And I was thinking, oh dear, here we go. We're all going to be siloed, and who's going to talk to whom? And is there going to be a movement building here? But when I hear about the history of the labor movement, or these elements of the labor movement, I'm like, oh, thank God we are starting on a new, you know, with fresh blood and fresh ideas. And I hope they're fresh ideas. I hope everybody isn't just looking for, you know, a minimum wage. I hope they're going for a more concerted movement of sorts. But at any rate, that's just a comment I wanted to make.
Well, this is kind of a freewheeling discussion. I agree with you 100%. They set up a different type of labor organization. It's different than all these unions. You can get their constitution online and read it. They limit the president's pay to 3 times the average salary in the unit. Well, you know, I mean, all our international union professions make at least 300,000, you know, and that's a problem in every organizing drive. They're so tied to their past, they can't change. And I think this ALU and also democracy in the union, they really came up with, this is what we have to do to win elections. And they were right. You know, all the experts said they were going to lose. They won.
Yeah, I was even impressed by the cross politics. Apparently, you know, it's the Trump supporters and the Biden, let alone somebody, even one article even made reference to that, and real communists, you know. So it sounds like there may be something fruitful happening.
Yeah.
So, Rob, I do want to mention, a few people have asked, this book is available through Pluto Press. If you use the discount code MEP, you get a very nice discount. It was on our publicity, but I want to mention that again. A few people have been in chat asking me about that. So
now I got an email from Pluto yesterday, said in May, all of their books are going to be 50% off.
Oh, so you're telling everyone ignore the discount.
I bet they're going to, I bet that's higher than your discount is.
Don't order the book today.
I say wait till May 1st. Yeah, you can look at Pluto Press, their website, and it should have that sale information on there.
Okay, well.
Yeah, it says right now, it's up there now, and it says it ends May 12th.
Oh, so Carol Ann, make your order. You have to order through Pluto's Canadian channel, I think. But there you go. Rob just told you can get half off tomorrow.
Yeah. That's a better discount than I get on the books.
Thank you. I absolutely will. Yes, thank you.
It's the Radical May sale.
Hey. So, I know there are a lot more questions, but without having taken advantage of Pluto's 50% off sale, we haven't read the book yet. So, Peter, go ahead.
Since I haven't read the book, I can't ask. I read the intro on Amazon. That's great. A chapter, whatever. Really great. Looks like a great book. I was just taking a little trip down memory lane to look at what people thought of the USMCA. And of course, I think you admit it's really had a tremendous impact on labor in Mexico, raising wages, implementing labor agreements, etc. And I'm reading from the People's World review of the Trump's proposal or the final approval of USMCA, and this is in 2018. Remember, this is the left of the left, supposedly, are saying that the NAFTA is what they call the new NAFTA. That the GOP Trump administration negotiated. Mexico and Canada would say Trump jammed it down their throats, has unknown enforcement strength, and that could negate it's better than the old NAFTA worker rights provision, the AFL-CIO. So anyway, the AFL-CIO is saying this new agreement could very well be worse than the old NAFTA because we don't know anything about it. And they are basically shit canning this new agreement, which turned out to be a phenomenal godsend to both the U.S. labor and Mexican labor. I wouldn't say. What was the date of that article? What was the date of the article? It was November 27, 2018.
Yeah, we're still campaigning against Trump there.
I know, but it was passed. But it was passed. It was passed. I mean, they knew exactly what it was, yet they were campaigning against it and against Trump, even though Lighthizer, who's the one that really wrote this thing, was a Trump appointee. Therefore, it couldn't possibly, this is the Russia attitude that it couldn't possibly be good because it came out of this populist right-wing Republican, which it did, Trump was has his issues and everything, but nonetheless, the attitude of this agreement, this international trade agreement, initially was the entire left was opposed to it. And so what made people, what caused that to happen, and what made the flip now that the whole AFL and Solidarity Center is pushing the USMCA and trying to implement the MCA and enforce it? How did that happen? How did the 180-degree turn happen on this?
I mean, I don't know how I had a great deal of difficulty getting any details and finding a copy of it I could read. I mean, the first year after it passed, I wasn't able to read it. So I'm not exactly sure what they were criticizing, what they'd heard about it, or they'd really analyzed it. And, they may have had a point, and what changed in Mexico too was AMLO, who made changes to Mexican labor law based on what was in there. So if he hadn't done that, now that would have been a whole nother situation in Mexico. It all would have been in courts, I suppose. So it probably took the confluence of both the change in the trade agreement and the change in the Mexican government.
But really, it can be enforced from the American side. I mean, that is usually how it is enforced by the the U.S. trade representative that is in charge of it and enforce it. So
what is the enforcement on it? I mean, the NAFTA had enforcement too. It was a joke. It was proven to be a joke.
No, right. So the U.S. trade representative is the one that enforces the provisions of the USMCA, but these provisions have to be, as you say, they have to be adjudicated. They have to be proven to be valid. So if, for example, in Panasonic, the Panasonic union that just won 80 to 20 in their election the other week, the company had refused to acknowledge the other union, refused the elections, and blocked, fired people that were in the independent union. I mean, just probably a whole list of probably 15 or 20 violations of the USMCA. And those had to be, documented and submitted to the U.S. Trade Representative as violations. So it takes a lawyer to do that. I don't think it really takes the Mexican government per se. I think it really just takes somebody on the ground, and it is the U.S. staff that actually documents this stuff. I mean, because it's a violation of U.S. law, so it's U.S. Trade Representative Office that sends attorneys down to document the violations. Anyway, that's a long way of saying there's a hell of a lot that's changed in the attitude of what Trump passed and what the meaning of this what the meaning of this trade agreement was from the day it was signed until today, when it's being used by the left. Curious.
Terry, you need to unmute. You're next, Terry. Go ahead.
Hey, how are you? And I have not read the book, unfortunately, but I will be ordering it. I just have this question. There's this promise of some internationalism here, and promise from like Amazon, for instance, the ALU, this promise that we might have an international labor movement beginning. How do you see something like that progressing in light of what you brought up with, the surveillance culture? I mean, which was horrible, the way with what you've documented, but is, exponentially worse now and getting worse each day. Like, how do we organize? And, I'm in touch with a lot of other people who are leftists in Europe and in South America and Mexico, but I'm always wondering if we really start to have success, won't they just cut us off at the knees in various ways? Some literally. I'll mute again because I'm working here, but let me know. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah, those are tough questions. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. Honestly, I've had problems on a couple issues with my email, pretty severe problems, and it really makes you wonder. But again, the media, the social media, the internet has made it pretty hard for most of these countries to really stifle dissent. I mean, they can shut down individuals for a while, mess with a group, but as a movement, I just think that we're probably better off with the modern forms of communication with the internet and WhatsApp, which I never even knew what it was, compared to what we'd had before when everybody's communications were going across the same cable under the ocean. So I'm sure there's problems there that well beyond what I'm aware of or have any ideas how to deal with, but I don't think that's our biggest problem right now.
Rob, do you have any? I mean, we've been, we had quite a talk today with a pretty good round. Do you have a closing comment you would like to make?
Again, I'm one who has too much to say about this thing most of the time, but I appreciate your time today. And when I started doing these in early February, I did my first one, I really was not very optimistic about the future. And, people said, well, you really need to. And I said, I hate to be dishonest with people or give them fluff. But with the emergence of Sentia and their success, and again, with the Amazon Labor Union and the success there, that I am pretty optimistic. And I really think we're going to see a better world in terms of labor than what we've seen for the last several decades. And I think there's many reasons to be optimistic about the future.
Well, it's great to see that you've gone from that pessimistic guy a few months ago to this position, Rob.
That's a big change.
Well, there have been some victories, and in next weekend, a week from tomorrow, Jane Holgate comes to talk about another Wildcat book, which is because it's a Pluto book, is 50% off.
Yeah,
it's called Arise, and it's all about shifts in power and strengths within, shop floor organizing that have made a real turn in the past period of time. And she was pointing to the Kellogg's workers coming out in such strength, and then other workers in the UK having more success. So we each week will be having more and more talks on international labor and local and national struggles that are going on. But of course, we also have our weekly Grundrisse class, and we'll be starting a volume 1 class in the fall of Capital. And there will be another class looking at Hal Draper's, one of the volumes of Hal Draper's 5-volume series on Marx's theory of revolution that David, who is here with us right now, is putting together with me. Terry, your hand is up again, or is that the same as your first question? I think it's the same hand raised.
That's my first.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know how to do this.
You don't need to take it down. It's a nice hand you got up there.
It's very yellow. All right, you guys have a good day. Thank you.
All right. So, Rob, I want to thank you for your time. You thanked us, but your time, not just coming here today, but doing all that hard research and writing and making a presentable book. Well designed, by the way. Was that a friend of yours who put that book jacket together?
No, Pluto did that. And, that's kind of a riff on old Mexican poster art. And
yes, it is.
Yeah, I liked it too. Took me a while to get used to it, but I really like it now.
Yeah. It's one of their more attractive covers, but their in-house people are pretty good designers.
They are.
So, Rob, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And
Bravo.
These were very good
Love your
questions.
work.
I have to say, I've been through some panels that I didn't get this good at questions.
Where was
for your
that?
time.
Where? What did you say? You didn't get?
I've been on several Zooms and radio shows and blogs. These were excellent questions for people who haven't read the book. I've had people who were supposed to have read the book that didn't ask as good of questions.
Well, this has been recorded. If you'd like a recording, I'll send it to you.
Oh yeah, please do.
And if you don't mind, we'll put it on our YouTube channel.
Oh, I'm fine with that. No, I mean, part of the thing is to keep this quiet, and part of my thing is to make as much noise as possible so it can't be swept under the rug and ignored. So that's why I thank you for your time.